Welcome to the France 24 interview. The world is likely heading into its worst recession in over 90 years, and poorer countries will be among the hardest hit. The G20 group of major economies has agreed to pause debt payments from low-income countries worth around $20 billion. But is that enough? My guest today is David Malpass, President of the World Bank Group, the international development-focused lender. David Malpass, thank you very much for joining us. Can we start by discussing the scale of this crisis? How bad is it going to be for the global economy and for the countries that the World Bank works in?
It's a deep recession. It's already underway. You see that in the numbers coming in very quickly from the developed countries where the data reporting is fast. And I expect that to extend to the developing world as well. We might say the deepest recession since the Great Depression.
And in the countries that you work in, what will a recession look like? When we talk about it in developed countries, we think about, mass unemployment, but there's a social safety net that compensates in many of those countries. What will it be like in the developing world?
It's a very difficult situation. There will be companies that shut down to the extent that there are private sector companies. And from the standpoint of government workers, their pay is more difficult for the governments to provide. I think one of the key difficulties, well, there are multiple. One is health, education, and food. The basics that people need, that children need, are all going to be under massive pressure. What we're trying to do from the World Bank side is to provide health emergency support. We will have programs in place in 100 countries by the end of April. So it's been a very fast response by the World Bank aimed at the initially at the health emergency that each of the countries is feeling.
Now, we've had leaders of the G20 major economies respond to your call for debt relief for those developing countries. The agreement is a freeze on bilateral loans. It's being given a figure of around $20 billion. What sort of effect will that debt relief have on those countries?
It's very important because without this moratorium, they would have had to be paying money largely to the developed countries and to China. And it's a lot of money, as you mentioned, $20 billion, but that's per year, meaning that kind of flow could continue, and that's large relative to the foreign aid programs of the developed countries. So it's very welcome. I think much more is needed. The capital outflows from the developing world have been very large, and so there's going to need to be a change in the dynamics in order to invite more capital to come into the countries to replace what they're losing right now.
It is, though, only a pause or a freeze on those debt payments. There have been calls for a cancellation of that debt in the short term, but also, of course, in the longer term. Does a freeze go far enough? It
helps, and the importance of it is that it's able to start right away. It's a May 1 start date, so the countries begin saving money right away. But you're right. For many countries, for at least several countries, and I think it will end up being several dozen countries, the pause should continue, and that becomes a form of debt cancellation. I think that will be needed. Keep in mind that many of the countries simply had too much debt even before the pandemic struck. And so that means there needed to be a new thought process on this system. I had complained about it before the pandemic, that it was debt piling on debt. And a lot of times the people in the countries aren't getting what they need from that debt. The contracts are with the government. It's a government, one government lending to another government, and the people never really see the money. And so I think there needs to be a change in that dynamic.
Do you think that it could lead to a greater cancellation of debt, a greater act by the developed world and by private creditors to relieve the burden?
It's going to be something that the world needs to work through as the crisis evolves. So I guess I want to say at this point that our focus from the standpoint of the World Bank is to provide a big net inflows to the poorest countries. So we're planning on $50 billion to IDA countries. That's the world's poorest countries, many of them in Africa. $50 billion to Africa from IDA alone, and that's over the next 15 months. So these are very powerful support mechanisms. And then, as the crisis evolves, I think we need to look at doing more.
Now, the G20 asked the World Bank and the IMF to participate in this debt relief, but you have some concerns about that. What are they exactly?
The starting point for the relief is official bilateral creditors. Those are from governments that themselves can borrow money in the markets and that have an ability to control their expenditures. That includes France, that includes China, the United Kingdom, the United States, all of those countries participating, and Japan, of course. And so that's very welcome. The difficulty with the World Bank and other multilateral development banks participating is that they have shareholders and bond covenants. So the World Bank borrows in public markets, and so if you say that you're not going to be receiving payments on the loans that you make, it undermines the premise of a multilateral development bank. I think the best starting point right now is to have the freeze start on May 1. That's the agreement of the G20. That's what Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, and I called for this in late March. And so I'm very glad to see the G20 pushing through with this effort. And France had a lot to do with it. China went along with it, and other countries all supporting. So this is a big agreement by a big group of countries to do something, to do the right thing and do it quickly.
Now, almost 3 years ago, the World Bank was involved with the issue of more than $300 million worth of so-called pandemic bonds. They were designed to pay out to countries in need during a crisis like this. But so far, they haven't been paid out yet because the conditions haven't been met. Why is that?
Yeah, $300 million of bonds. This was a trust fund that the World Bank facilitated, and so Germany and Japan put money into a trust fund that paid. There was a cash window, and then there was this idea that you could issue bonds and they would be triggered if there was a pandemic, and that hasn't occurred. So it's a disappointment. There may still be some funding that's brought in from the private sector to the trust fund in order to help with this pandemic. But I think that the concept of it, of trying to get the private sector to put money in to a trust fund is not necessarily the most, or is not the most successful way to go forward. What we want to do is create money in advance that helps countries with preparedness so that they're ready in case a pandemic hits. That's going to be a better model, and it's one that is already in the international system. There doesn't have to be this financial engineering that was done 3 years ago in order to create the concept.
Okay. We're talking about response to a crisis largely at the moment from developed countries, from institutions like yours. What have we learned from this response, and are governments stepping up in a way that demonstrates solidarity with developing countries?
One thing we've learned is that there can be fast action when people are specific about the goals. What we wanted to do with the 100 programs that I mentioned to you, we now have 100 countries where they have identified their needs in terms of what do their nurses need, what do their medical providers, the frontline people need, and then we could quickly put together a response to that. So that's one thing we learned. And then I think another is that the developed countries really do want to help the developing world and are willing to do it with their money. They're putting in money to the facilities, and so I guess one other thing is preparedness helps a lot for those countries that have a health system that can absorb the equipment that's needed. They're doing better than others.
Okay, David Malpass, President of the World Bank, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to you for watching as well. Stay with us. More news coming up on France 24.
France 24 es rigurosidad, precisión y responsabilidad. Somos una familia comprometida con el periodismo y la verdad.
C'est une des seules chaînes d'infos où on nous laisse jouer en plateau avec des Legos, avec des robots, avec tout un tas d'objets.
We take a return ticket to revisit some of the key people and places of the last 50 years of world television news.
على فرانس 24 يمكننا أن نحاور أصحاب القرار من العالم في كل الميادين ولدينا المساحة لكشف ثنايا مسيرتهم.
Aquí en France 24 tenemos a varias personas de distintos países, algo que es un reflejo de cómo es Latinoamérica, con culturas muy distintas. Y allí es muy bonito encontrar que en el deporte todos tenemos algo en común.
Les femmes, elles sont souvent victimes de l'actualité internationale, mais ce sont aussi des actrices majeures de la géopolitique. Et d'ailleurs, on en parle dans France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.